Martin Stain sat in his car, impatiently waiting for some movement. Eventually, he heard the metallic sound signifying the release of the hydraulic rams holding the ferry doors close. Then, accompanied by creaks and groans, he saw a crack appear in the bow bulkhead before him. He watched the bow open and the ramp lower and extend into place. Martin then had to wait his turn to drive onto dry land, followed by the long trail through customs. Only then could he honestly say he was back in England. He pulled into the customs area and wound down his window, the cold night air slapping him in the face. "Anything to declare?" asked the uniformed man as he took Martin's passport. "I got some wine and booze," Martin replied, "but I've only been to Holland. Bought it there." "Could you pull over to that spot there, Mr. Steen? We would like to examine your vehicle." The customs officer pointed to an empty bay as he spoke. Martin Stain couldn't believe it. He had made this trip many times and had never been stopped before. Annoyed at the inconvenience and grumbling to himself, he pulled over to the designated bay, closed his window, and waited. Almost 15 minutes went by as Martin pondered his decision to use the ferry and road system instead of the much quicker and easier option of flying. The booze was an added complication. If customs appropriated this load, it would wipe out his profit from the last 3 months. "Bugger," he mumbled to himself repeatedly. His personal admonishments were interrupted by a tap on his window. "Mr. Steen, would you follow me?" A tall man in a slightly wrinkled brown suit spoke. Martin knew it wasn't a request. He got out of his car, locked it, and turned to follow the man. He was led inside a large building, through some corridors, and up 2 flights of stairs before eventually being shown into a room. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment, sir?" Again, not a question. Martin entered the room, which was furnished with a metal-framed table with a formica-covered top showing scars from years of abuse. 2 chairs of matching framework stood on either side. Martin sat in the one furthest from and facing the door. Eventually, the door opened and the man who had led him there returned, carrying a large file and a laptop case. "Mr. Steen, may I call you Martin?" Before Martin could answer, the man continued, "Good. You have just returned from Holland, have you not?" Without waiting for a response, he continued, "There you traveled to Amsterdam where you met with Mr. Eric van der Wark, to whom you delivered £2 million worth of blood diamonds." Martin's face began to drain of color at the mention of Amsterdam. His face was completely ashen at the precise mention of the diamonds. Martin kept quiet, trying to figure out what was going on. He had always assumed he could claim ignorance about being a courier for illegal diamonds, but now it was spelled out for him. He would have had to be foolish not to realize what he was carrying. The first time he suspected something was wrong was when he cracked the combination lock on the case he carried. He did it every time after that, mostly to keep himself occupied on the long ferry crossings, dreaming of the day he would have the courage to cut and run. For now, he dismissed that thought and focused on his current situation. He hadn't been arrested or cautioned, and the man in the suit hadn't given his name. Martin knew enough about news to understand that something was not normal about this. He just sat and waited for the man to speak again. As the color returned to Martin's face, Inspector Gray watched him intently. "Now, Mr. Steen, Martin, I think we are in a position to help one another." He stared at Martin, measuring the bewilderment on his face. "As you may have guessed by now, I am investigating your employer. And no, before you make yourself look ridiculous, I do not mean Charles and Curtis Sheik, for whom you work as an accountant. I, of course, mean Mr. Francois Grimard, dear old Mr. Grimm himself, the one for whom you run errands." Martin's face regained its former pallor, and his head drooped in defeat. "If you are, as I expect, able to enlighten me and help with my inquiries, I have been authorized to offer you an out," Inspector Gray said. Martin raised his head and looked at the inspector, surprised to see concern on his face. "I am offering you witness protection if you turn Queen's evidence," Inspector Gray continued. "Yeah, like you did with Derek Bennett. That did him a lot of good, didn't it?" Martin spat out, the first time he had spoken since entering the building. "Why don't you just beat me to a pulp and chop me up for the pigs yourself?" "We were actually thinking of blowing you up," the policeman offered. If Martin had looked bewildered before, his expression now could only be described as dumbfounded. "Of course, if you refuse, we will pick you up on your next trip to Amsterdam, or worse, your replacement." Martin physically shuddered at the thought. He knew he was in trouble. If he said nothing, the best he could hope for was being caught for smuggling. If the next shipment was intercepted, word would get out that he was an informant. If he went against Grimm would likely silence him. And when the next person took over, who would blame Grimm for their disappearance? This left Martin with two choices: accept their offer or run. Running would be difficult. He would have to convince Angie to run with him and secure new identities. While he knew where to obtain such documents, Grimm could easily trace them. Martin slumped in his chair, feeling trapped with no clear escape. Seeing his defeat, the inspector continued to outline the procedure for witness protection. Martin listened carefully, asked a few questions, and was disappointed with the answers. He was not convinced things would go as promised, but the inspector had answers for every query. Then Martin asked, "So where would Angie and I be going?" The inspector looked at him in surprise. "Before I agree to this, I have to talk it over with her. We'll have to agree on a location." Martin spoke carefully. "I know you said we could have no knowledge of where we'd go, but I need to make sure Angie is okay with it." Gray's response was sharp. "You can't be serious. She's the last person you need to know where you are." Martin looked at him incredulously. "You don't know." The inspector shook his head. "Wait here." He left the room and returned with printed sheets of paper, which he handed to Martin. "Sign these, and then I'll show you something." Martin carefully read through the documents, signed one, and passed the other back without signing. "The dates are wrong by over 3 months. It's dated last January." The inspector looked annoyed. "Just sign it, will you?" Martin made no move to comply. "Listen, we have court orders for phone taps and bugs on nearly every house, building, and business connected to Mr. Francois Grimard. We found nothing of value. Everything points to him being a fine, upstanding citizen. I know he's paying someone to keep him informed." Martin said nothing. "We became aware that he was using you for more than just keeping books. I started paperwork to bug your house, but then I realized I needed another way to get information." His voice lowered to a whisper. "I broke the law. I got a private investigator to bug your house. I thought if Grimm didn't know, he might slip up. I was right. He's running his business from your place and 2 other locations." Martin became both interested and fearful. "Go on. I need you to sign this contract. It makes things official," Gray said, sliding the papers over. Martin hesitated. "We, or rather I, have discovered many things about Francois, his business, your wife, and of course, you." Martin's face turned scarlet with anger and shame. He was angry about the intrusion and ashamed of what had happened in his marriage over the last 6 months. "When was the last time you were intimate with your wife, Martin?" Gray asked. Martin replied indignantly, "A week last Monday. The last time I returned from a trip abroad." "Intimate, or did you perform oral intimate and receive it in return?" Gray continued. Martin squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. "In fact, that has been the norm since we began monitoring your house. You return home, and this is what happens," Gray said. "Why do you think that is?" Martin mumbled. "She thinks I'm seeing other women." Gray's response was sharp. "You really don't have a clue, do you?" He slammed his hand on the unsigned documents. "Just sign them." Martin jumped at the sudden noise, but still made no move to sign. "Your wife has been seeing Mr. Francois Grimm while you're away. Why do you think she has always seemed so distant when you return home?" Inspector Gray's words struck Martin with a jolt. As the realization hit him, the color drained from Martin's face, and he bent over, vomiting. The inspector watched as the vomit sprayed over the table and floor, ruining the documents. He felt no disgust at the scene, only a deep sympathy for Martin. Martin retched until he had nothing left, and his stomach continued to spasm. Gray left him to finish and pull himself together, returning with a bucket and mop to clean up the mess. He left again and came back with cloths and disinfectant to help Martin clean himself off. Afterward, Gray brought a beaker of water and some duplicate forms. Martin took both, drank some water, and signed the forms. "What time are you expected home tonight?" Gray asked as he worked on his laptop. "About half an hour," Martin replied, glancing at his watch. Gray turned his laptop around and placed it on the table in front of Martin. "Here is a live feed from your house." "I'm sorry," Gray said as he pointed out the controls on the screen. "You can use the mouse pad to adjust the camera and zoom in with the plus and minus keys." Martin recognized his bedroom and the two occupants, Francois Grimard and his wife, Angie. As he watched, Martin's stomach began to churn again, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. Gray's voice continued. "Francois hasn't been around for nearly a year. Angie said it's been 8 months since she last saw you, but she's been seeing Francois regularly." Martin's face turned red with a mix of anger and shame. The clarity of the HD picture was remarkable, but today all he felt was revulsion. The feed showed Angie talking to Francois, discussing plans and expressing her commitment to him with no emotion in her voice. "I'm really sorry about this," Gray said, his tone sincere. "No one deserves to see that." Martin choked out, "Anything you want. Just get me away from her." Gray stood, feeling conflicted. He needed Martin to cooperate to take down Francois Grimard. Martin was shaking with anger. The love he had once felt for Angie had turned into a deep hatred. He wished he had noticed her deceit earlier, but now his feelings were consumed by a desire for revenge. "You'll need to act naturally when you go home, as if nothing is wrong," Gray instructed. "I won't mention our conversation or give anything away. Your life probably depends on it, understand?" Martin nodded. "I don't care about myself right now. I just want to get my revenge on her and Francois." "Good," Gray said. "As long as you can keep that to yourself, you'll be safe until the court case," Inspector Gray said. "Afterwards, you'll be set up with a new life. You'll be held in protective custody until then." Martin nodded and asked, "Can I go now?" Inspector Gray thought for a moment. "Yes, but you need a believable excuse for being late," he said. As Martin headed toward the door, Gray added, "I thought being stopped by customs would work." "Yes, such a lengthy stop." Gray paused for effect. "And yet you come through with all your belongings." Martin stopped in his tracks. "You delay me for 2 hours, ruin my marriage, and generally destroy my life. And now you want to take my perfectly legal goods. All for the greater good, I assure you," Gray said with a predatory smile. The rest of the journey back to Martin's car was spent in silence. Martin was shocked to find his car had been emptied. His clothes and other items were stacked near the trunk while his contraband was neatly arranged on a trolley next to them. "Sorry, all for appearances. We don't think you have a chaperone, but we can't be sure," Gray explained. Martin picked up his clothes, threw them into his suitcase, and packed them into the trunk. "See you soon," offered the inspector. "Go to hell," replied Martin, getting into his car. He didn't even light a cigarette before pulling off. "We will be watching you at home, but we can't be with you everywhere. Good luck," Gray said, trying to offer some support. He knew the next week and a half would be very difficult for Martin. Martin drove off, fuming with anger at everything. His life, his wife, the delay, and the inspector. He didn't pay much attention to his speed. What was the point when he felt he might be dead in 10 days' time? An hour later, he pulled into his driveway. The usually reassuring crunch of gravel under his wheels only fueled his anger. He stopped the engine, sat for a moment to gather himself, then got out and retrieved his suitcase. He locked the car and, with a deep breath, headed inside. "Hello, dear. You're later than I expected." Her voice was frosty. Martin glared at her, remembering Gray's instructions to act normally. "I said you were late," she continued, adopting a reprimanding tone. "Yes, I heard you. Thanks for stating the obvious," Martin spat back. "I've been stuck with customs, and they robbed me." "There's no need to take that tone with me," she said. "Isn't there? Well, let me tell you now. I've had it up to here," he said, holding his hand above his head. "I am fed up with all this travel, customs, and your constant complaints. The last 3 meals I cooked were for you, and that was a long time ago. Now, what do you have for me to eat?" Angie's eyes widened in shock. Martin had never shouted at her, rarely swore, and never before had he sworn at her. "There's a salad in the fridge," she said. "That's another thing I'm fed up with," he shouted, walking into the kitchen. He slammed open the fridge door, pulled out the salad, and threw it into the bin, still on the plate. "Now cook me something proper, or get out of my house." "I will not," she shouted back. "In fact, I will do nothing for you until you apologize." The sound of the slap echoed through the house. "Now, get me something to eat, or you can leave," Martin said. "I'm pissed off, and one of the things I'm pissed off with is your attitude." Still rubbing her cheek, Angie began looking in the freezer. She found little that suited a quick meal and asked, would bacon, eggs, and some black pudding be all right? She sobbed, frightened of this man who had walked through the door 15 minutes earlier. The man she thought she knew, now seeming very different. "Yes, but no salad," Martin replied, and Angie nodded, wiping tears from her wrist. Martin poured himself a large scotch and walked back into the kitchen. Angie had a pack of bacon thawing in water, preparing chips, and maybe some grilled tomatoes. "That'll be lovely," Martin said, sitting down with the daily paper, "and beans, instead of the tomatoes." Angie said nothing as she worked, trying not to cry. Normally, Martin would have been eating his way through the salad, but today he was different. Part of Angie was glad for this new side to him. She turned on the fryer and began peeling potatoes for chips. Soon, Martin was enjoying a hearty breakfast of twice-fried chips, thick slices of bread with butter, and black pudding. He had learned to make the black pudding from his father, a butcher, because he didn't like the mass-produced stuff. He made his own and had a few regular customers. Every 5 weeks, he bought a gallon of fresh blood from his old schoolmate Graham, who owned a pig farm. "Thank you, dear. That's probably the best meal you've cooked for me in well over 6 months, he said, placing his knife and fork on the plate. "Now, go upstairs and freshen up. It's time you started behaving like my wife again," he added cheerily, with any sign of anger gone from his voice. He noticed her eyes darting to her handbag and a flush on her cheeks, but she made no move to pick it up as she left. "I should have done this months ago," he thought, following her upstairs. 20 minutes later, she was lying on the bed, waiting for him. He approached and, without a word, initiated their intimacy. As she complied, he noted her surprise and wondered if she had begun to question the truth of his earlier comments about himself. Her reaction to his touch seemed to confirm his doubts about her perception of their physical relationship. When he finished, he told her to clean herself up and prepare for another round. She surprised him by complying without protest and moved to the bathroom. As she washed, she reflected on the recent changes in their relationship. She had been shocked and somewhat pleased by the difference in his behavior and presence. She began to regret her involvement with Francois Grimard, realizing the danger and deceit had overshadowed any initial excitement. As she looked at her reflection, she saw a face marked by shame and regret. She had been cruel to her husband and feared she was now at risk of being used in ways she had never imagined. After cleaning up, she returned to bed and attended to her husband once more, unsure if he was awake. The following morning, they both wished he had treated her like this all their married life. Each understood in their own way that they might not be making the decisions they were forced into now. Martin left for work physically satisfied for the first time in nearly a year. However, he reminded himself to maintain his usual demeanor of depression and dissatisfaction. As he drove to work, he thought about what he once had and how it had been destroyed by his unfaithful wife and the manipulative Francois Grimard. By the time he arrived at his office, the anger he had felt the night before had returned, etched into his face. The weight of his actions and decisions for the near future loomed heavily on him. Charles Chisek quizzed him about his delay at the port. Martin wondered why Charles was interested and how he knew. He considered several possibilities. His wife might have told Francois, or there could be electronic surveillance in his car or house that he wasn't aware of. Another possibility was that there was a mole among the authorities. He was rattled by the thought that either he or his house was being watched, or that there might be a mole in his department. The last idea chilled him to the bone. If that were the case, he was as good as dead. Once that thought took hold, it wouldn't leave him. Why hadn't he gotten a contact number for that copper? He thought to himself. He managed to come up with some ideas to calm his mind, but the mole scenario was something he couldn't resolve. Regardless of the situation, every door slam, loud noise, or voice made Martin flinch as he drove home in the evening. He half expected a gunman to leap out at every traffic light and saw danger in every passing car, even police vehicles. He arrived home without incident but was still filled with anxiety as he crossed the threshold and closed the door behind him. For the first time in many years, Angie greeted him with unusual enthusiasm. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him and pressing her lips against his with an intensity he hadn't experienced in a long time. She pressed her body against him, her excitement palpable. Martin wondered where she had learned to act this way. Certainly not from him. Was this how she greeted Frankie? How many times had she involved him with her lovers? The thought disturbed him. "Something smells nice. What's for dinner?" he asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at her, noticing her disappointment and confusion as she struggled to answer. "Well, steak and ale pudding, mash, veg, and gravy," she replied, her eyes welling up before she retreated upstairs. Martin felt a tear forming as well. He was puzzled and wondered if she was having second thoughts or if she had come back to him. Should he try to involve her in his next trip to Europe? He hesitated, troubled by memories of her past rejections and her association with Grimard. The food smelled good, but he lost his appetite. He moved to the lounge, poured himself a scotch, and turned on the television, though he hardly paid attention to it. As he sat in front of the TV, he knew his rejection of her had been a mistake, driven more by instinct than actual desire. He reflected on how he should have reacted differently and how he had dismissed the gestures she had made. Despite the change in her attitude, whether due to recent events or her earlier behavior, he was caught up in conflicted emotions. He liked the change in her demeanor and the warm welcome he had received, even though it brought back memories of how things used to be. When Angie called him to dinner, he poured another scotch before joining her in the kitchen. The meal was one of his favorites, something she hadn't made for him in at least 2 years. He felt a pang of regret as he realized how long it had been. Ignoring the unsettling thought that there might be an unwanted ingredient in his meal, he took a forkful of food. The taste was exquisite, better than he remembered, and he tried to push away the disturbing thought of whether her cooking had changed due to new skills or influences. "Everything all right, darling?" she asked, noticing his discomfort. "Really good, love," he replied, finishing his bite. "It seems like ages since you cooked this for us. Sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to reject you. I was just caught off guard. It's been a long time since you welcomed me home like that." "No, not shocked, just surprised. Maybe we can try again after dinner." Her face lit up with a smile. Martin thought sadly that it had been a while since he had seen that smile. Tonight reminded him of some of the reasons he married her. As he enjoyed his meal, he was reminded of past moments that had been intense and satisfying. During their time together, she had been attentive and enthusiastic, and he had found pleasure in her actions. He had been unable to coordinate his movements due to her attention, but the experience had left him feeling a warm, pleasurable glow. As he came down from that high, He noticed her smiling at him with pride. She waited for him to speak, and when he finally did, he said, "Wow." He reached for his glass, surprised to find it refilled. Raising it to her, he said, "Thank you." For a moment, Martin wanted to embrace Angie and kiss her deeply, but he was reminded of what he had seen the previous night. He knew where she had learned those skills, and with whom, which reignited his anger. He struggled to control it, forcing himself to shift his thoughts. "Did you do anything today?" he asked. "Not much, just some shopping, housework, and cooking dinner," she replied. "Didn't you see anyone?" "No one came around," she said, pausing. "Oh, I talked to Charlotte on the phone. She mentioned that Francois Grimard has a position available, and said she'd put in a word for me." Martin's mind raced. On one hand, he didn't want his wife working for Grimard. On the other, she deserved whatever came her way. However, he was not about to let Grimard have his way. He chose his words carefully to avoid saying anything negative about Grimard that might get back to him. "We don't really need you to work. We manage well enough. I'd prefer things stay as they are, with you looking after the house while I work. It fulfills a certain traditional role for me," he said. Her smile faltered slightly, and he noticed a brief flash of relief. "Charlotte said he pays well and is a good employer. You'd be able to stop traveling, and we could spend more time together, getting our relationship back to where it was." "I doubt it," he growled, losing his composure for a moment before regaining it. "It would take months to train someone in the specifics of my work in Europe." She squealed with delight and ran around the table. "My clever man. Let's go upstairs so I can congratulate you properly." He followed her upstairs to their bedroom. Once there, she eagerly approached him, and they were soon engaged in an intense moment of intimacy. Afterward, Martin rolled away, leaving her to sob quietly. Her tears were not from physical pain or the act itself, but from the guilt and the realization of what she had become. What's gotten into him? She wondered, reflecting on her actions. After tending to herself, she returned to bed, finding Martin snoring peacefully. She lay down beside him and began to cry again, struggling to find sleep. The next morning, Angie stirred briefly as Martin turned off the alarm. He noticed her restless sleep and grimaces, which suggested her rest was troubled. He thought, "Good," as he got out of bed and immersed himself in work to escape his unsettling thoughts. Occasionally, he gave up trying to suppress them, sitting back to rationalize his situation. He found few positives and many negatives. He had once believed they had a good life, that she was as devoted as he was. He had loved her deeply, but now he loathed what she had become. Forgiving her infidelity seemed impossible when faced with the distasteful reality of her actions with another man. He was overwhelmed with nausea, remembering how his wife had tainted both his food and herself. He vomited into his wastebasket. Curtis walked in, and without concern, asked, feeling unwell, "Martin." If Martin hadn't had his face in the basket, he might have noticed Curtis's smirk, indicating he was aware of Martin's distress. Despite the unspoken meaning of Curtis's comment, Martin resolved that just resigning was not enough. "Sorry, not feeling too good," Martin said, wondering why he was apologizing. "Excuse me. I'll be right back." Martin left to clean himself up, deciding to take the rest of the week off. With his job now seemingly secure for the moment, he felt a slight relief. Curtis, accustomed to Martin being more passive, didn't respond to his assertiveness. As Martin drove home, he was lost in thought about a new idea that had come to him while leaving the office. He felt confident it was simple yet effective, though it had one complication. If it worked, he would be free. If not, he'd have to resort to the plan suggested by his anonymous contact. Angie, meanwhile, was struggling with her own issues. On the phone, she was having a tense conversation with Frankie. His calm, controlling tone unnerved her. She was relieved it was over the phone rather than face-to-face. "Listen, you belong to me now. You'll do what I want, when I want. If you want your husband to stay unaware of what you've been doing, you'll follow my instructions, Frankie said. His calmness made Angie uneasy. Frank, I shouldn't have been with you. It was wrong. It's unthinkable that you want to involve me with your friends. Leave me alone, she pleaded. Frankie's voice remained steady. I'm not going to stop. Now that you work for me, you'll do as I say, whether it's with others or not. Don't even think about confessing to your husband. It's not worth the risk. Angie was shaken. After the call ended, she felt the weight of her decisions and was terrified for both herself and Martin. When she heard Martin's car pull up, she was filled with dread. Martin, on the other hand, was focusing on his plan. He parked outside his house and spent a few moments finalizing details in his mind, feeling pleased with the cleverness of his idea. He knew it had one complication, but was ready to tackle it. When he entered the house, he heard the shower running and wondered if Frankie had visited earlier. Angie appeared downstairs, and Martin noticed her red eyes. Have you been crying? He asked. No, she replied defensively. I got soap in my eyes. It's a bit late for a shower, he remarked, his voice carrying a sharp edge he didn't intend. I had a rough night, and just woke up. Why are you home early? She responded. I came home sick, he said, looking around for signs of any visitors. Seeing none, he decided to lie down for a while. As he noticed her guilt and fear, he felt a bit of the affection he once had for her slip away. Although the bed was unmade, there were no fresh signs of infidelity. He lay in bed for about an hour, trying to work out the complication in his plan. He realized he might need to adjust his routine and had an excuse ready for it. Excited, he packed 2 suitcases and went back downstairs. He noticed Angie had been crying more and asked, You've been crying, haven't you? Is it because of how I treated you last night? She agreed it was, and he suggested they go away for a few days to sort things out. We seem to be at odds lately. A short break might help us reconnect. Her eyes lit up briefly before fear returned. How long? I'll check with Charles. If he says no, we'll leave tomorrow night and come back late Sunday. If he says yes, I'll try for all of next week, he said. Angie quickly agreed, eager to escape the looming threat. Yes, please. Where shall we go? Martin smiled. I made some tea earlier, but it's probably cold now. I'll make a fresh pot. Let's discuss destinations over tea. As they chatted over tea, discussing possible getaways, they both masked their own secrets and agendas. Martin waited until after 3:30 p.m. to call Charles Chisik. Hello, Charles. It's Martin. Curtis mentioned you went home ill. Are you feeling better? Somewhat. Still a bit queasy. I think it's best if I take tomorrow off too. Angie, and I would like to get away for a few days. Could I take next week off as holiday? That's fine with me, Charles replied. Martin could hear a mumbled conversation in the background. After a couple of minutes, Charles came back on the line. We'll need you back at the end of next week, so we'll see you Thursday. Goodbye. Martin was used to the abrupt hang-ups from both Charles and Curtis, leaving no chance for a proper farewell. Turning to Angie, he said, We're coming home Wednesday. Angie managed a forced smile. She had hoped for a way out of her predicament. I suppose that means you'll be heading back to Europe again, she asked. He didn't need to confirm. They both knew it was implied. Martin fetched the suitcases from the bedroom and locked them in the trunk of the car. I didn't realize you had already packed. Do you want to leave immediately? Angie asked. Ready when you are, he replied. I'll just use the bathroom, she said. Once she was out of sight, Martin checked her handbag and was relieved not to find a syringe. He took her phone and hid it under a chair before taking the bag to the car. When he returned inside, Angie met him at the door. Have you seen my handbag? She asked. Yes, I put it in the car. Come here, we might as well start as we mean to continue, he said, pulling her close and kissing her. Martin loved driving, finding it easy to navigate using mental maps. He drove north and west, connecting with the A1 at Redfoot. They continued north for a couple of hours and found a hotel for the night. Conversation was sparse. Both were absorbed in their own thoughts. Angie was focused on finding a way out of her situation, while Martin was still grappling with his anger and feelings of betrayal. In the hotel room, their interactions were more intimate. Martin made an effort to rekindle their connection, trying to ensure she felt valued and cherished. When he finally let her rest, she fell asleep quickly. Martin made sure she was comfortable before quietly leaving the room to check his car. The next morning, they had an early breakfast. Angie had repacked their suitcases and was puzzled by how dirty Martin's clothes had gotten overnight. Their first stop was Rosslyn Chapel, which had been restored and looked better than before. Later, they headed into Edinburgh for sightseeing. The oil warning light came on in their car, but Martin ignored it. They stayed in Edinburgh, enjoyed a late lunch, and did some more sightseeing, including a castle tour and a ghost walk. That evening, Martin sampled various single malts, and Angie had to help him back to their room. The next morning, they barely made the 10:30 checkout time. Martin suggested another walk around the city, which Angie thought was to help him sober up. However, Martin had other plans. They wandered around until Angie found a high-end hair salon, where Martin encouraged her to get her hair done. While she was there, he withdrew a substantial amount of money and paid for their accommodation. After retrieving the car, they continued heading north. Martin continued to ignore the oil warning light, and when Angie mentioned the engine noise, he reassured her it was nothing to worry about. They were almost at Junction 2 on the M90 when the engine failed, accompanied by a cloud of black smoke. Angie discovered she had no phone, and Martin called for roadside assistance. As they waited, Angie complained about not having her phone. "It's always in your handbag. Are you sure you haven't lost it somewhere? Besides, I have mine. You can use that once we get where we're going," Martin retorted. "There probably won't be much service anyway." Angie had no response. She didn't really need her own phone. It was mostly used for talking to friends and coordinating with her contacts. The AA man arrived and informed them that the engine had ceased due to running out of oil. Martin was impressed it had lasted so long since he had tampered with it. "It's just a company car," Martin reassured Angie as they were transported to a repair shop. "We'll hire a car and get reimbursed for it when we get back." Less than 4 hours later, they were on the M90 again in a nearly new Toyota Auris. A few hours after that, they arrived at a small croft, far from any signs of civilization. They hadn't seen any other buildings for over half an hour as Martin navigated through a maze of lanes. "Where are we?" Angie asked. "Somewhere in the middle of the Grampians, at least 20 miles from anyone I know of," Martin replied, as he went around the side of the croft and found a stack of dry peat. "Ah, here it is," he said, holding up a key. "You've got to love their sense of security up here," he grinned. "Did you plan this without telling me?" she asked. Martin didn't answer her. They explored the croft, which was adequately furnished but still sparse in places. They were both struck by the thickness of the stone walls. The fridge and freezer were well stocked, enough for a month. Aside from walking or stargazing, there was little to do but reconnect. Over the next few days, they focused on reestablishing their bond with renewed passion. As the reminder on Martin's phone signaled Wednesday morning, he knew it was time to confront Angie about what he had discovered. He made a pot of tea and took it to the bedroom where Angie was resting. Her flushed cheeks showed signs of recent intimacy. "Sweetie, thank you," she murmured. "Angie, I have something I need to tell you," Martin said, his voice trembling. Angie looked at him, noticing his discomfort. "What's wrong, sweetie?" "I know everything," Martin said. "I know what you've been doing and what's been planned for this weekend." Angie's face went pale. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I've been trying to end things with him, but he's insisting on controlling me." Martin's heart was heavy. "I'm going to leave you here. You have plenty of food, and I'll be back sometime after the weekend, maybe a few days longer. In the meantime, You need to decide whether you want to stay married to me. You can write a full confession detailing everything that's happened. I'll read it when I come to fetch you, and then I'll decide what to do next." He turned to leave, adding curtly, "Don't try to leave. You'll get lost." Martin left her crying on the bed and headed south. As soon as his phone got a signal, it started receiving messages. One informed him that his car was repaired and ready to pick up, and others were from colleagues reminding him of his return. There was also a message from Curtis asking how he was enjoying Dunfermline. Martin smiled as he drove to Dunfermline to pick up his car, knowing it was fitted with a tracker, so a chaperone was unlikely. After picking up his car and paying for it, he returned to the car hire place to complete the paperwork for returning the Oris. He arrived home just after 10:30, having stopped by his local chip shop for fish and chips. He enjoyed his meal with a beer, followed by another for dessert. As he crumpled up the paper he had used, he remembered Angie's phone. He dug under the chair and retrieved it, finding several missed calls from Charlotte and others, including a message that read, "Friday 7 p.m. for guests. Make dinner, no pork." Martin felt a mix of anger and satisfaction, knowing he had disrupted those plans. Martin went to bed with a plan forming in his mind and woke up early the next morning. At 6:30, he made a call. "Hello, mate. Hope it's not too early," Martin said. "Hello, yes, you're early. About 2 weeks early by my reckoning," came the reply. "Got someone to get rid of." Martin chuckled at his friend's joke. "Not just yet. Maybe soon. In the meantime, I'm working on something for some friends of Angie. How soon can I have some today if you want?" 2 gallons, really?" his friend asked. "I can do it. When will you be over?" "Tonight might be a bit later than usual," Martin said. "Okay, see you then," his friend agreed. Martin showered, then stopped by a DIY shop on his way to work, picking up what he needed. He arrived early and made sure everyone knew he was in good spirits. Curtis observed, "You seem happy today." "Yes, Angie and I have had a great few days. We haven't been getting along well recently, but we've worked things out," Martin replied cheerfully. "In fact, we're going away again for the weekend." Curtis asked, "Have you heard from Mr. Grimard this week?" "No," Martin answered. "Why?" Curtis responded, "That's a shame. I could have taken her with me. She'd have loved to see Amsterdam or Brussels." Curtis left without his usual remarks, and shortly after, Martin received a call. "Martin, I need you to go to Brussels tomorrow morning. After making your usual delivery, I need you to wait over the weekend and bring a package back with you on Monday. It needs to be extra discreet, so no bringing the lady along," the voice on the phone instructed. "Usual time and place for the pickup?" Martin asked. "No, can you pick up early at 6 o'clock in the morning? You'll be telephoned with the details for the other job," Mr. Grimard replied before hanging up. Martin looked at the phone, irritated by Grimard's rudeness. He wondered if the guests tomorrow were connected to his employers. Regardless, they wouldn't be pleased. Martin booked a Eurostar crossing for himself in his car, departing from Folkestone at 9:15. He then searched for a reasonably priced B&B for the weekend. Leaving work early, he drove to a large toy store before heading to Graham, the pig farmer. After conducting his business, Martin loaded 2-gallon containers of pig's blood into his car and drove back to the road. Halfway to the road, a car appeared in his headlights, blocking the lane. Martin, feeling uneasy, slowly approached to see if he could get by. The car seemed unoccupied. As he shifted into reverse, his door was suddenly flung open. "Mr. Steen, we meet again," a voice said from the shadows. Martin recognized the voice of Inspector Gray. "Apologies for the covered approach," the inspector said. "We've placed additional surveillance in your house and office since our last visit." "What about the car?" Martin asked. "We checked it while it was being repaired. There's a tracker but nothing else," the inspector explained. "And my wife?" Martin inquired. "She's safe where she is," the inspector replied. "She has ample provisions for at least another fortnight." The inspector continued, "Tomorrow, Travel along the A16 and E40 to Neuvistelstraat in Street Peters, Belgium. Take exit 18 off E19. At some point, you'll be involved in a tragic accident. Martin nodded. I'm concerned about a potential burglary at my house. Could you ensure any culprits are arrested? The inspector agreed and added, don't let any officers enter until they've heard a big bang. As the inspector returned to his car and Martin drove past, he felt reassured by their brief meeting. Once home, Martin brought in his purchases and began preparing a surprise for his wife's guests. First, he emptied the rat poison and blended it into a pulp with the liquidizer. He mixed it with the pig's blood, hoping this would slow down or prevent clotting. After shaking each container to ensure the mixture was well combined, he unrolled some light plastic tubing, attaching one end to the compressor in his garage. He ran the tubing through an air vent in his kitchen and into the living room, setting up a switch that would be triggered when the front door was opened. He checked the setup with several dummy runs before adding the final pieces and retiring for the night. Martin awoke early at 5 a.m., dressed, and after a coffee, made the final adjustments to his plan. He double-checked everything, then kicked in his front door to break the lock, wedging it closed from the inside. After setting the trap, he left through the back door and drove to pick up his package. At 8:30, he was queuing to drive onto his train. He took out his wife's phone and sent a text, then removed the battery. 15 minutes later, he sat in his car on one of the Eurostar carriages, checked behind him, and retrieved the briefcase from the footwell next to him. He knew this would be one of 4 identical cases, each with a combination he had learned on previous trips. Martin attempted the combination, and after 3 tries, the briefcase opened. He took a breath after each lock clicked open, ensuring no one was watching him. Inside, he found the expected bag, which he removed and closed the case. He checked again for any observers before returning the case to the adjacent footwell. His hands were trembling as he looked inside the small velvet bag, exhaling sharply when he saw its contents. He took out his wallet, calming himself with deep breaths. A few minutes later, hands still shaking, Martin opened a small foil package and removed a condom. He unrolled a couple of inches, paused to steady himself, and then transferred the contents of the velvet pouch into the condom. After tying a knot and tearing off the excess, he managed to swallow the condom with the aid of some juice. An hour after boarding, he drove off the train. 20 minutes later, he passed through customs and was heading toward Belgium. About 2 hours later, he was pulled over by a man with a French accent who urgently pulled him from his car and into a waiting van. As the van sped away, Martin heard a sickening impact and a distant thump of igniting fuel. The Frenchman smiled at him, his breath heavy with garlic. Martin's journey continued uneventfully with vehicle changes and no conversation from his companions. Just over 3 hours later, he was bundled through a door in a back street. He was pushed towards some stairs and, obediently climbing them, reached a door at the top. It opened to reveal a familiar voice. "Come in, Martin," the voice greeted. Martin remained silent, overwhelmed by the events since being pulled over. "You were pulled over for a routine traffic stop," the voice explained. "One of your brake lights was faulty, and you were unfortunately hit by a large lorry hauling steel. You were killed outright. Your body is only identifiable from DNA and dental records. I'm afraid your wife is a widow." Martin sat quietly, fully grasping that his past life was over. A knock at the door interrupted them, and a man entered, spoke in hushed tones to the officer, and left. "It seems we got to you in time," the inspector said. "The case you picked up had nothing valuable in it. We also found out there was a contract taken out on you. We don't think you were supposed to return from this trip." Martin was stunned. "So, if I hadn't already been dead?" "Yes," the inspector confirmed. "If you hadn't been dead, you soon would have been." Martin's face drained of color, and he began to shake. The inspector handed him a hip flask. "Here, take this." Martin took the flask, sniffed it, and took a deep draught of the brandy inside. The warmth of the brandy flowed through Martin, helping to numb the shock from the news he had just received. Inside, he was torn between his loyalty to Angie and his anger. He had wanted to take her with him, but his anger also wanted her to suffer. Eventually, he concluded that the best punishment would be for her to mourn his death and possibly blame herself or her lover. Martin was given a file and instructed to learn as much as possible about its contents. The inspector then explained what would happen over the next couple of weeks before Martin was moved into his new life. He pulled out a laptop, saying, "I thought you might like to monitor your old house." It was almost 7 p.m. when Martin reinserted the battery into his wife's phone. The laptop screen flickered to life, and the inspector navigated through several windows, showing different views of Martin's former home. A black Bentley pulled up, and 4 men, Frank, Curtis, and 2 unknown individuals, exited the car and moved toward the door. Martin clicked on the window showing his front door from the inside. He saw shadows through the glass, and then the door flew open. He heard the expected hum start up and smiled. Frank spoke in an unfamiliar language, which Martin guessed was due to Frank's family background. Curtis commented on the door being broken, and Frank replied that Angie was missing. The men entered the lounge, oblivious to the hum coming from the garage. The electronic view switched to the living room. Curtis noticed an expanding orange balloon in the corner nearest the door just as he was bringing drinks over. The balloon burst with a loud bang, covering the room in red liquid. Martin sent a text to Frank from his wife's phone, saying, "Pig's blood." Frank's reaction was furious, and soon after, 6 armed policemen burst in, arresting the men at gunpoint. Martin and his companion laughed heartily at the unfolding spectacle. The inspector commented, "Nice touch with the pig's blood. If you weren't already dead, I'd say you'd be in trouble now." Martin's mood shifted when he realized the possible consequences for Angie. He had not considered the impact on her, and the realization tempered his amusement. "I didn't think it through. I don't want her harmed," he said, his voice almost pleading. The inspector's response was cold. "We can't do anything to help her." Martin asked, "Can or won't?" The inspector's glare indicated that for now, Martin had no bargaining power. The reality of both he and his wife being in prison, though for their own protection, struck home. Meanwhile, several hundred miles away, Angie was busy writing and rewriting her confession. "My darling husband, I am deeply sorry for the things I have done both with Frankie Grimmard and to you. I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am, or how I can ask for your forgiveness. As you may have guessed, it all started because of Charlotte. About a year ago, when you were away, Charlotte told me she had a double date with Marie, Frank, and another man. She said Marie had to drop out and asked if I could fill in. I initially refused, but she insisted and assured me nothing would be expected beyond dinner and dancing. I foolishly believed her. The evening led to Frank's bed, though I can't explain how it happened. I tried to understand it for weeks after, and again since you left me here. I felt guilty for cheating on you, but there was something about Frank that I found attractive. I admit, he was powerful and difficult to refuse. I am so sorry for my actions, and for the hurt I've caused you. I can't explain it, but even you have to admit he was powerful, and his allure was difficult to resist. I felt overwhelming guilt for cheating on you." Angie paused, her tears smudging the paper. She folded the note and placed it on the table, resting her handbag on top. Taking a sharp knife from the drawer, she cried as she walked to the bathroom, stripped off her clothes, and ran herself a hot bath. For a week, Martin was kept in a small flat, subsisting on takeout and being quizzed about Grimmard's business, his court appearance, and his new identity as Eric Williams. He had to swallow a valuable condom daily. A week later, he was moved to a more comfortable and secluded location. When he was settled, Gray visited him. Eric sensed something was amiss as soon as Gray entered the cottage. His 2 guards made themselves scarce. Gray looked at him with sadness in his eyes. "Martin, I have some news. It's not good. We sent someone to retrieve your wife. There's no easy way to say this. She has committed suicide. She was found in the bath. She had cut her wrists. Eric fell to the floor in shock and wept. Gray felt helpless and wanted to say something but had no words. All he could think of was the insincere, "I'm sorry for your loss," which felt inadequate. Eventually, he managed to say, "You shouldn't blame yourself." Eric looked up from the floor, his face flushed with anger. "Blame myself? Why would you think I would do that? I blame that woman and the slag I married. Blaming myself doesn't come into it. To be honest, in a way, I'm glad. But that doesn't mean I'm not sorry. For God's sake, I loved her for long enough." Gray studied him, and reaching into his jacket, handed over his hip flask. "I have 2 bottles in the car you might want. Bring them in." "I need a drink," Eric snapped. "Yes, bring it in." "Eric, there was a note for you. I have a fax copy. I'm not sure if you should read it, but I'll leave it to you," Gray said, fishing a folded piece of paper from his jacket. Eric took the paper, nodding more to himself than to Gray, and began to read it alone. Gray paused at the door, looking at him before turning away to fetch the alcohol. Eric read her last goodbye with regret. He regretted leaving her alone, getting himself into a situation that made her so vulnerable, and the entire painful episode. But most of all, he regretted that he would never hold her in his arms again. Eric and Gray drank together, with Eric discussing his life as Martin in the early happy days with Angie. Gray observed Eric's shifting moods, worried about his ability to pull himself together. Then Gray remembered that no one had yet told Eric about the repercussions of his actions. "You know the surprise you left for dear old Francois and friends," Gray said. He was rewarded by a faint smile from Eric's tear-streaked face. "We should be able to lock Mr. Grimard away for a long time on their confessions alone. Monsieur Chiswick was also a great help. You probably won't even need to testify. This gave us grounds to get a warrant to search their premises. It turns out your bosses, the Chiswick brothers, had encoded books, and Mr. Francois Grimard had the key. With their cooperation, we were able to access all his records. A lot of people are going down. Your act of revenge has paid off. You've been more helpful than we could have hoped." Eric smiled at the news. He hadn't been looking forward to court or allowing Francois to know he was still alive. Gray fell silent, perhaps wondering if he should have kept some information to himself. "I'm angry about what happened, what she did, and the whole messed up situation," Eric ranted. "I'm angry she can't be punished for what she did to me. I'm angry she's dead and not here with me. What am I supposed to do now? A dead man has no friends, no family, no one. I'm all alone," he wailed, tears flowing freely. Gray watched him, feeling helpless and inadequate, his own eyes misting with empathy. "You will have support," he offered, realizing as he spoke how inadequate it sounded. Eric lashed out verbally. "Inspector Gray," he said, his tone bitter. Gray remained silent, knowing he had said too much, likely due to the alcohol. Looking at the empty and nearly empty bottles, he saw Eric stumble to his feet, swaying wildly. Eric flew at the inspector, accusing him of being responsible for Angie's death. Before Gray could rise to defend himself, Eric managed to land a few blows. The noise brought the 2 guards into the room, who separated and restrained Eric. Gray spoke to the guards in French, and after sitting Eric back in his chair, the guards returned to their posts. "Sorry, I shouldn't blame you," Eric said as he regained his composure. "It's okay. I understand these last few weeks can't have been easy," Gray replied, meaning it. He couldn't imagine what Eric was going through, despite knowing the facts. "How about we finish this and get some rest?" Gray suggested. Eric didn't respond but searched for his overturned glass. He handed it to Gray, who poured him the remaining whiskey, and then finished the bottle himself. Raising his glass, Gray said, "To a new and better life." Eric echoed the sentiment, raising his own glass. Martin's funeral was subdued, attended by only a few mourners. Angie was destitute, and even her friend Charlotte did not attend. Eric wanted to go, but was advised against it. Eric Williams settled in Gloucester the Saturday after the funeral and began working as a data entry clerk. Just over a week later, Francois Grimard was sentenced to 15 years for human trafficking, exploitation, assault, making threats, conspiracy to commit murder, smuggling, dealing in restricted goods, bribery, threatening behavior, and breaking and entering, all to be served consecutively. He would not see freedom again. Curtis received 70 years, Charles got 47, and the two traffickers received 20 years each. Many of Grimard's employees were prosecuted, with sentences ranging from 2 to 18 years. Charlotte received 5 years for procurement and living from immoral earnings. Eric worked as a data entry clerk until he was confident he was no longer under surveillance by Interpol or British police. Once he was sure there was no ongoing surveillance, he took a 2-week holiday, driving across Europe. For some reason, he only stopped in Brussels for a few hours. A few months later, he retired to the Algarve. If anyone ever asked about his wealth, he claimed it was from wise investments. Eric's days in the Algarve were quiet but filled with haunting memories. He often walked along the cliffs, staring at the sea, lost in thoughts of what could have been. Some nights, he imagined Angie beside him, laughing at his jokes or complaining about the sand in her shoes. On other nights, he cursed her for her betrayal, her weakness, and the pain she caused. But there were rare moments of peace, moments when he felt like the past had finally loosened its grip. He befriended a few locals, kept to himself, and avoided discussing his past. The anonymity suited him, though he sometimes missed the intensity of his former life. In the end, Eric was a man marked by the scars of deception, love, and loss. The revenge that once drove him now seemed hollow, a remnant of a life that had ended with Angie's death. One warm afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the Atlantic, Eric sat at his usual spot at the edge of the cliffs, holding a half-empty bottle of wine. He watched the waves crash against the rocks below, his thoughts drifting. He raised the bottle in a silent toast to the past, both its tragedies and its fleeting joys. To the dead and the living, he whispered to the wind, finishing the bottle. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, he stood up and walked slowly back to his quiet, solitary home.